Welcome, everyone. My name is Utkarsh Vaidya, and I am representing the Work on Climate events team. And it's my pleasure to welcome Matthew Nordan today, who will be speaking with us. And we also have Daniel on the call, who's from Innovate Climate. And I'll let Daniel introduce Matthew, and then we can get started.
Thanks, Utkarsh, for collaboration here with Work on Climate. Excited to have Matthew Nordan with Azolla Ventures here today. Yeah, clearly I haven't had my coffee yet. I'm over in California. Innovate Climate and Innovate Climate Careers was made to bring a human component back into connections, and this collaboration with Work on Climate is really to help elevate venture funds and opportunities within venture funds to help the ecosystem connect more. But with that, I'll hand it back to either you, or Utkarsh, or Matthew.
Matthew, I think, has a few slides that he would like to present, but just as a quick introduction, Matthew is is representing Azolla Ventures, and he's a general partner at Azolla, who are very climate oriented in their investing. And so we'll be hearing a bit about their approach, some of the opportunities they have in their portfolio as well. And we'll open the floor up for any questions from the audience in the later half of the call. But with that being said, Matthew, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share a screen. Let me know, can everybody see me and hear me here?
Yes,
give me a thumbs up.
Yeah, and hear you.
All right, good stuff. Thank you so much for having me here today. I think the service that you're performing with folks who are, either looking to laterally move jobs in climate tech or move over from other areas into this one is really important. And I'm going to follow the guidance of our organizers here. I'm going to talk today about jobs for climate impact. And I'm going to try to share with you my personal journey and what brought me here. That was a specific moment where I realized, man, I can do better than this. I can do something that's more impactful. I'm going to follow that guidance and really go through here in these parts. I want to give you a quick background story on how I got here. Talk about our impact first investing approach at Azolla, which is unapologetically focused on climate impact and weird, but we think weird in an important way, and one that an increasing number of actors in the ecosystem are beginning to come around to in some ways. And then third, I want to share some job opportunities with you. I'm going to talk about it on two levels. One, sort of recurring jobs to be done that we see coming up in our portfolio companies, regardless of what they do. And then I'm going to take 5 examples of the 26 companies that we backed that all kind of are different archetypes at different stages of development, show you what they're recruiting for that I think will give you a flavor for how these companies develop over time. I'm going to try to do all that in about half an hour and then just focus on Q&A from the organizers and from you. So my story, I spent the first 12 years of my career in the technology analyst world, where the product is research and advice, including co-founding and leading a firm called Lux Research. That's the largest tech analyst firm focused on climate. I imagine if you're at a climate startup, you may have been assessed by Lux. I got recruited out of that into venture capital at a firm called Venrock. That's arguably the oldest venture capital firm, originally the VC arm of the Rockefeller family in the 1930s, and the first investor in lots of iconic companies from Apple to Intel. I then tried to figure out what I wanted to do with my life and worked on several things at the same time. One of them was a holding company called M&L Partners, focused on first-of-a-kind project financing for climate propositions as US-China cross-border joint ventures. That work then led me to focus on the problem I'm focused on now. How do you get funding for true breakthroughs of climate at the earliest stages, where you kind of fall into a gap between what can be supported by grants and where mainstream angel and venture investors will tread. And I'll tell you the story of how we got to that and how that became Azolla Ventures in just a minute. But my, we can do better moment was really the following. I got recruited into Venrock, which was a storied venture capital firm, billions of dollars in assets under management, amazing people that I learned a huge amount from, but not specifically focused on climate. It was primarily a firm that's kind of one half tech investing, which I think is always silly. It's all technology, isn't it? But, software, internet, et cetera. And then kind of half life sciences with a little experimental group of people trying to figure out climate and energy kind of on the side. And it was a very tale of two cities experience for me. I was fortunate to be able to help back some companies that did extraordinarily well. One of them being Nest, where we were the only new investor in the Series C round in 2012. Company was acquired by Google for $3.2 billion just 14 months after that. I also worked hard to support a company in the portfolio then called Ativa, that was kind of a little sleepy but ambitious company trying to reinvent electric vehicle drivetrains. It's now better known as Lucid Motors, very highly valuable competitor to Tesla at the high end of EVs. But this stuff isn't really what I wanted to do. I wanted to fund true breakthroughs for climate at the earliest stages when they have a risk of dying on the vine. The technology risk is still outsized. The team may be incomplete. The strategy may be 2 pivots away from done. How could you do that? And I was debating, is this something I think I can get done inside a hugely successful mainstream venture firm? And there was one day where it was clear the answer was no. I was in New York that day for the big Monday partner meeting. And it was a rare Monday where we had not one, which was normal, but 2 companies come in and do the big final pitch to the partnership that was the last step in the investment process. First company that comes in wasn't even in climate. It was kind of a deep tech company, but doing something really bold and audacious, very early stage, had a lot of great things about it. Incredible technology, great founders, a really interesting kind of supportive network of advisors. They leave the room, the partnership debates it and concludes, we're not going to do much of this kind of stuff in our next fund. And we don't want to really telegraph things as the last few investments in the current fund we won't do in the next one. So we're going to pass. Second company comes in. It is 2 founders that have built an iPhone app targeted at sorority members at party schools on which they can rate guys on dimensions, including their anatomy. They leave the room. And the conclusion was, we need to lead every dollar of this Series A round at an outsized valuation because they cannot leave New York without a term sheet. This is exactly what we're going to do more of in the next fund. I left that room. I went to a little conference room and I made 2 phone calls. The first one was to my spouse. And I was like George Costanza in that Seinfeld episode, like, I'm done. There's nothing for me to do here. But then the second one was a call to a brilliant young woman named Sarah Carney, who I'd gotten to know over many years, who came from a very different world than me, from the philanthropy world, where she ran a small family foundation that granted to pre-commercial energy tech research in university settings. We had bemoaned this kind of capital gap for the earliest stage, hardcorest breakthroughs for many years together. And just 2 weeks before that, she had been in my office at Venrock and laid out to me her vision, where she pointed out these numbers were all true then in 2013. They're all much bigger now. She said, Matthew, did you know there is $600 billion of impact investing money, potential impact investing money, sitting in US family foundations alone? Forget about corporate foundations, donor advised funds, the other 200 odd companies on the planet. And I stopped her and said, I don't believe you, because at that time, the entire venture capital asset class was only $150 billion. I thought there was no way that a corner of impact-driven assets in one country was 4 times bigger. She was, of course, correct. And she said, and did you know that there are mechanisms by which these assets can be put to work to fund specifically this gap? These entrepreneurs that fall in a hole where grant funding runs out and before mainstream finance gets involved. And I said, tell me more. So, she had a vision to develop a 501c3 public charity around this idea. I joined up with her as an uncompensated volunteer for the first 4 or 5 years to bring it to life. That is a 501c3 public charity called Prime Coalition that focuses on filling these gaps in climate finance with impact-oriented capital. And Prime is, now wildly successful, has done many things other than this early stage investment program, has one in impact measurement and monitoring, where there's a software tool called Crane. You may have used it. You can find it at cranetool.org that measures prospective greenhouse gas emissions reduction, has an effort in early climate infrastructure, a whole bunch of different things. But early on, when we started and we're focused, only on this early stage financing gap, we thought, if all these dollars are out there and they're not in the game, why is that? Particularly from institutions that prioritize climate as one of the areas where they want to bring change into the world. And we concluded it wasn't one thing, it was many. They weren't able to assess the landscape, we heard, when we went out and did 140 interviews in 4 months to find out where the gaps were. So we got really good at a process to assess all of the early stage startups focused on climate and energy in the US. We look at north of 2,000 a year. The second was, I can't figure out where the highest and best use of my dollar might be for impact. So we developed this emissions reduction potential methodology that's now this SaaS software tool. There was I don't know if I'm compliant based on the mechanism by which I want to deploy this capital to make sure that I can do it in line with what the regulations are, depending on which pocket of my foundation it comes out of. So we developed a methodology to do that. And I'll talk more about where that comes out later. We didn't initially start by raising a fund. We didn't want to sort of start with the solution and try to jam its edges off to fit it into the problem. Instead, we just had a blank sheet of paper and said, what if we could do those things and just bring impact investors directly to invest in companies that fall in this capital gap at an early stage? We ended up backing 10 companies that way between 2015 and 2018, mobilizing about $25 million, and it succeeded beyond our wildest expectations. Two of those companies are no longer with us. They ran the hypothesis. That's a good thing. If we're not seeing failures in the portfolio, we're not taking enough risk. We're not being true to our mission. One of them has not yet raised a downstream priced equity round, but 7 out of 10 have done that. 3 out of the 10 are leaders in their categories with 9-figure valuations. And more importantly, 7 out of those 10 have done real commercial deployments or partnerships. Companies like Opus 12, now called 12, Connector, and Melinda. That then gave us conviction that, okay, let's do this for real. Let's do it with a captive pool of capital that will be less kind of hardship, less onerous on entrepreneurs to be able to bring money in by herding cats of individual investors. And let's do it with a real investment team that can support portfolio CEOs and founding teams with things other than capital. So we raised in 2018 our first proper fund called Prime Impact Fund, about a $50 million seed vehicle, focusing on seed, pre-seed, Series A. The 16 companies that made its initial investments in over a 3-year period you see here. And you're seeing those initial investments described. How much did we invest with what partners, what role did we take? I think the things you'll see in this are that we don't have any sector focus at all. We don't see the world in like transportation and the grid or, industry versus power generation. We look at the largest, the fastest growing, and the most neglected sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So by largest, think about things like cement, 8% of global emissions. We backed a company really at the concept stage out of MIT when the founders were still in academia, focused on low carbon cement manufacturing. Another example, not an industry, but a unit process used across industries. One of those is thermal separations, where you got two things mixed together and you separate them caveman style. You boil them and one of them boils off first. Sounds like something behind the scenes you don't think about. 12% of total US energy usage, a greater portion of emissions, but hidden because it crosses so many industries. So we backed a company called Via Separations that focuses on doing that step, but with a membrane rather than a thermal approach that reduces the energy and the emissions by 90%. The second thing, the fastest growing wedges that sort of drive climate. The worst offender is air conditioning because we want the countries as they develop and have higher GDP per head to live, rich and robust lives as people in the Western world have, who just by dint of history were lucky enough to get rich first. And if you're in a tenement apartment in Karachi and you achieve a certain amount of earnings, what's one of the first things you buy to do the right thing by your family? You buy a window air conditioner. Unfortunately, it's one of the worst things from a greenhouse gas perspective. We backed a company called Gradient that is doing a kind of Nest Ring drop cam play in the unloved product category of window air conditioners to greatly decarbonize them. And then lastly, the most neglected wedges, your cocktail party fodder conversation from this talk is that last year, by the best math we can come across, about 3% of global emissions, industry-wise, just behind cement, steel, and glass, was making the solar panels, where about 3% of emissions come from the first step in the process, where you melt polysilicon at 1600 degrees Celsius to make solar wafers. We backed a company called Leading Edge Equipment Technologies that can reduce the silicon waste from that process by about half, thereby decreasing the energy and the emissions by about half. So, what did we do after we had, the fortunate ability to back these 16 extraordinary CEOs you're seeing here? Incidentally, while we are not a fund specifically focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's a very important value to us. And because we seek out neglected opportunities, underestimated companies, we tend to back more female CEOs and more BIPOC CEOs than the average that you would see across deep tech venture funds. We think that comes out in the portfolio. We said, well, let's figure out ways we can serve these founding teams better. And one way to do that was to raise a larger vehicle with more follow-on capacity, so we could not just participate in the seed or the Series A round, but be a good partner through impact, particularly through the inevitable ups and downs where more short-term minded or less impact motivated investors might back off, and we would need to lean in. And we did that under a different name. We ended up renaming the fund to something that, renaming the firm to something that was more evocative of our mission in the world. And we named it after a microfern, genus name Azolla, which is what solved climate change 50 million years ago when atmospheric CO2 concentrations were 3,000 ppm. This little fern that you've seen in koi ponds pulled about half the atmospheric carbon out of the air all by itself, but then more importantly, set conditions that other flora could grow that return the planet to balance. And it's a good sort of analogy for the role that we play as this frontier investor. The thing that's been common in our current fund, Azolla Ventures, which is a $200 million target, and in Prime Impact Fund, the predecessor fund at 50, and then in syndication, where we backed $25 million worth of transactions, is these three evaluation criteria, and it's what makes us different. We only invest in companies where the solution area could have a gigaton scale climate impact, an impact at the same level of wind or solar today on greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And our investment team can't put our thumb on the scale and nudge middling things over. We have a separation of powers. That assessment is done by our sister nonprofit to make sure that we're being honest and true to our values. The second is a principle of additionality, where we don't chase hot deals. If you're in a company and you were fortunate enough to be getting great attention in Silicon Valley and you've got 3 or 4 term sheets and you're trying to bid up things, that's great. We're going to be cheering from the sidelines and you don't need us. We focus on neglected opportunities and underestimated companies that typically have elements of risk or time frame that are just a little bit more difficult for mainstream investors to stomach. And again, we have a methodology for assessing that. We can't just kind of assert it ourselves. Our sister nonprofit validates that as well. And then third, we only invest in cases where we have kind of bullet point level seed milestones of what would have to be achieved on the first couple rounds of financing in order for mainstream investors to get more interested down the road. Wow, I realize that I'm probably spraying like a fire hose here, but we have a lot to cover and you're all very smart people. So I am now going to transition and talk about some both recurring and then some company specific job opportunities in our portfolio. And I want to start off with some roles that often are hidden because they don't have normal titles and they aren't things that you would put on your LinkedIn necessarily with these names. But in nearly every company that we've been fortunate to support, we see them having these roles come up at some point. The first one, I'll describe as right hand to the CEO. And it typically is someone relatively early in their career, very ambitious, able to translate between technology and finance and wear a lot of different hats, who really is the extension of the CEO's brain and hands to get things done. And it's a widely varied role where people who are doing this sometimes are literally carrying the CEO's bags, and at other times are doing incredibly strategic things, like figuring out what the terms should be for the next financing round. Sometimes this is called chief of staff. We've seen it as finance and operations manager. Sometimes it has a BD title, but this is the pathway that someone would go to be COO inside that company, or upon graduation to found and lead as CEO of their own business. And when people ask me, I'm relatively young, I'm right out of school, I've only had a job or two, what's the number one thing that I can do to position myself to be a credible CEO level founder in a future company? It's that job, and nearly everything we back has it. The second one is a commercial lead. And you'll note here, I'm not saying head of sales. I'm not saying head of business development, but it really is the person in an early stage startup, bearing in mind that, we fund companies at super early stages, sometimes even concept. In Prime Impact Fund, of the 16 companies that we backed, 8 of the CEO's first non-academic job was CEO. So before that, they were a grad student or a postdoc. They typically will bring someone into the business to work with them that isn't selling, and it may not even be BD, kind of mapping out and building relationships. It's figuring out what do people want to buy and how do you get to them and what are the unmet needs. These titles vary wildly. Sometimes they're biz dev, sometimes they're strategy. They typically don't have a C. This person becomes the chief commercial officer in the company over time, tends to hire a head of sales. And the third one that I'll get across is sort of a techno-economic modeler. If you know the long duration energy storage company Form, not one of our portfolio companies, but we think very highly of it. One of the founders there was this guy named Marco Ferrara, who's just brilliant, and has a title that I think now is SVP analytics or something like that. His job was to figure out what is the techno-economic value proposition in fully loaded cost per kilowatt hour. How does it really compare against alternatives, and how does it really fit into what customers can stomach at what level of scale? And we find that role, the nuts and bolts detail in the Excel spreadsheet of how do we make the math work for our customers to come up everywhere. I would say we also see, some other roles come up that aren't aren't generalized across all companies, but they come up frequently and are hard to fill. We found that a significant number of companies we back have a real asset component. So not only developing the battery technology, but would be owning and operating the energy storage facilities. They typically have a chief development officer and people underneath them that are figuring out the asset part of the business beside the technology part of the business. There's typically an external engagement role, whether that's public affairs, community relations, government relations. I'll draw that as distinct from the next topic. That comes up frequently. And then particularly for companies that are monetizing greenhouse gas emissions, the market landscape is really undeveloped. If you look at regulatory mechanisms for monetizing GHG reductions in the US, they're largely built around CO2 as a molecule, not carbon as an atom. And that means that there's hard work to do for companies in influencing regulatory and policy decisions and working with end customers to help provide input into those decisions to help make the market for things around carbon. That's a really hot position, and I think one that's hard to fill. I'm going to now quickly, and then we'll cut over, I guess, at the half-hour mark to Q&A, and talk about 5 of the 26 companies that we've backed, since that syndication mode, before Prime Impact Fund that I first presented. And I'll try to give you a flavor for what these companies are and what stage they're at. So the first one I'll talk about is called Lilac Solutions. It's the first company that we were fortunate to support in Prime Impact Fund. And really at a stage that, demonstrates our role. The CEO had done a great job of raising fairly modest amounts of capital in very small check sizes from friends and family, but kind of had a gap of milestones that had to be hit before more mainstream investors would consider funding the business. We came in, sort of filled that, came onto the board as the first outside board member, and worked closely with the team on the aspects where we could be helpful, things like storytelling and fundraising and team building. And Lilac, fortunately, was kind of in the right place at the right time, with an extraordinary approach and brilliant people. They are in the business of lithium extraction. If you wanted to electrify all the vehicles tomorrow, we need to produce about 30 times more lithium globally. Existing resources and technologies might get you 5 to 10x the way there. To go further, you need to open new resources that aren't economic today. And Lilac does that through a sort of hybrid chemistry and material-based science approach that uses ion exchange, that pulls lithium ions and only lithium ions out of an incoming fluid stream under one set of conditions and spits them out under another. Lilac, now I think last summer, they raised $150 million, Series A round at a very attractive valuation that was co-led by T. Rowe Price and Lower Carbon. That was really intended to position them to go from being a technology company with some pilots to doing, a greater number of pilot installations globally that will lead to full-scale commercial facilities. And if you went to their website, you would find, 36 open positions that are in every discipline you can imagine in such a company. They're kind of internal accounting and finance type roles. There are business-oriented sort of business operations roles, but you would find people working on the chemistry of those ion exchange beads that do the function of lithium extraction. You would find people kind of downstream from them in development, engineering the systems that take those beads and turn them into reactors, that are the building blocks for a plant. You would find people in fabrication, cutting the metal and fitting the pipes to put those systems together. You would find people in field operations, primarily in Argentina and Chile, as well as the US Southwest, who would be supervising drilling operations where you would get brine out of the ground to be processed by these reactors, people to operate that equipment. And then because a company, at this scale, hiring at this pace, needs to hire people in order to hire and train the people. That's the last category that you'd find. We go to a couple others. I mentioned beforehand Sublime Systems, a company that we were fortunate to support at the concept stage in low carbon cement. It is moving from having developed a technology and validating its price and performance in a laboratory setting to now thinking about going out and building a first demonstration facility, probably in conjunction with a partner, where they would translate what's been demonstrated in the lab at increasing levels of scale to a commercially relevant level of scale. And that's really the focus for the company right now. So if you went to their website, what would you find? You would find the BD head to engage with those customers and bring them down a development funnel. And then you would find folks who are doing everything around that first sort of demonstration facility and then doing tests on the products that came out of it. You would also find a patent engineer, because intellectual property is important in all of our companies, but particularly important in this one. Verdox is a company that's focused on direct air capture. They have a novel direct air capture method to pull CO2 out of the air using a variant of quinone molecules whose binding affinity for CO2 changes by very large amounts in response to small voltage changes. And the idea here is that the energy-related cost of capture could be reduced by a very large amount, potentially an order of magnitude amount, that would bring atmospheric CO2 capture well below in the limit, the kind of $100 per ton mark, that is considered a magic number. They, similar to Sublime, are now in a stage where they're working with initial customers to put their first demonstration units in the field. So you would find lots and lots of engineers of every type, from mechanical to systems to test to process to electrical. You would find a variety of chemists and people who are formulating, sort of the core materials that are at the center of this direct air capture technique. And then you would find, folks who are managing operations and finance and programs with each of these individual early customers. A couple last examples. Clean Crop Technologies is an agricultural technology company that is focused on shelf life extension, among other things. A very large proportion of food, it can be 10, 20, 50% of food that leaves the processing facility or leaves the field actually spoils on the way to you. And ends up being wasted from the store shelf in transit in homes because it has a shelf life. And there are a bunch of companies that have focused on extending the shelf life of things, generally by coating them with something. Clean Crop does this in a different way. They have a reactor that forms a cold plasma from air, and that plasma degrades the toxins and pathogens and pests on the surface of seafood or meat or nuts or vegetables that causes them to degrade. And the pictures you see from this company are crazy. They've had a demonstration with a large corporation that I should not name, but you've got a picture of sort of 4 beef patties and you're supposed to guess the ones which were treated. They're the 2 that are still pink while the other 2 are brown. They are focused very much on extending their number of pilots. So you'd find there an electrical engineering director, a mechanical engineer on this product team, and then also sort of an internal admin assistant. Last one is a company called Avalanche, who I am repping by means of hoodie today. I try to wear a piece of portfolio company gear every day that I can. Avalanche is the most technically aggressive project, where we've been able to support these entrepreneurs. They are literally trying to do Iron Man's chest. A micro-scale nuclear fusion reactor, and not cold fusion, hot fusion, very hot fusion, where the sort of initial specs are on the order of something like 12 centimeters around, 36 centimeters long as a cylinder, 15 kilowatts thermal, 5 kilowatts electric. And the initial application for this may be space propulsion, where they recently announced a win of a $7.5 million grant from the Defense Innovation Unit to develop a fusion-based space propulsion mechanism for small spacecraft. This is a company that is hardcore R&D. There's nobody in the business, really save one, who is not active in the lab at most times. And the roles that you would find there are very specific, narrow, and hard to recruit for science and engineering roles. In a country like ours now, where semiconductor processing is being onshored, it's very difficult to hire plasma physicists because Intel will write them very large checks. However, Intel is not trying to sort of save the world through fusion, at least not at this point. We hope they might in the future. And I think you'll find that the people at Avalanche are very devoted to that mission. You also would find folks with expertise in high voltages, because you have to drive this system with relatively high voltage feed-throughs that are typically not found, in devices of this size and shape. Other examples of this we could go through. So that's really, everything I had prepared to talk about. I think I'll now probably go back to Utkarsh and see if there are questions from the organizers, and then maybe questions for me.
Well, just want to say thank you, Matthew. That was very insightful. And if I may, so that was also a masterclass, I think, in effectively communicating a lot of information. And, as someone that's trying to work on an early stage venture myself, I appreciate that part of it as well. So one thing that I was particularly interested in is your focus on a lot of early stage investments, pre-seed, seed. And so I was wondering, what level of technology readiness or adoption do you want to see before investment?
It's interesting, because I think if you were to ask this question of a lot of folks in venture, for very good reasons, their incentive systems are different, right? Our incentive system is built around impact. Our organization, governance, et cetera, have all been designed around that. you would hear them say, well, we want to see it be over a certain technology readiness level. We would tell you we want to see it under. So if something is at a point where it's really been demonstrated in a proof of concept that proves out technoeconomics, we are applauding those entrepreneurs from the field. We want them to do great. There are a lot of people who can invest in them. That's not a match for us. We typically are on somewhere of a spectrum between concept, where what exists is an academic paper, maybe laboratory experience, or even just an idea. In the Avalanche, the fusion case, that company was founded by two people who came out of Blue Origin, out of Jeff Bezos' space company, who are not fusion systems people by design. They were able to see the problem from the outside in, from the adjacent field of developing rocket thrusters. And they had an idea and a white paper with a simulation. That's good for us. I think the farthest out we go is really a point where there is a bench scale proof of concept that has not yet been reduced to a product, some kind of MVP. Once someone has got that MVP stage, we are probably not a good match as an investor because of our really early stage focus.
Yeah, I think that's definitely helpful. I just have one more question, and then I think the audience must be brimming with questions. So we'll open up the floor for, yeah, I can see a lot of questions coming in for the audience. But given the current turbulent economic times that we're going through at the moment, has the funding environment tightened for climate change businesses at all, do you think?
We're starting to see the glimmers. So, you know, I've been doing work in this area since 1997 because I'm an extremely old man careening toward death. And I've seen this movie twice. I saw it in 2001 in, you know, sort of the internet and digital media and telecom, and then again in 2008 more generally. And I think the way you have to think about it, right, is that, you know, finance is like a pyramid. And at the very top, right, where the water flows down to everybody else is the ultimate, you know, owners of capital, which are typically, you know, pension funds and endowments in our world where we have minted a lot of billionaires for good or for ill. High net worth individuals have also now become part of that top of the pyramid. And, you know, money flows down. It flows down to early stage and growth stage and whatever venture capital funds, and then flows down to portfolio companies and everybody else who supports along the way, like project finance. I think the thing to bear in mind is that the minute there is a significant and enduring reduction in the stock market, if you're one of those allocators of capital at the top, you see the world in an allocation model where you have X% in, which is a small percent, right? Like a few points in venture, and X% in private equity, and X% in art, and X% in real estate. But, you know, you're pegging all that against the biggest blob, which is public equities, right? Sort of stock market listed securities. If, as we've seen happen the last few months, stock markets go down by 20%, you still have to maintain your allocation model. So there's what's called the denominator effect. Because you're 20% down in these things, because the price went down, it means you're now 20% overweight in everything else. And because you at, you know, MIT's endowment or, you know, AXA insurance or whatever, made commitments to invest in funds, you got to like honor those. The only thing you can do is not make any new commitments. So now money slows down going into venture funds. Now you're a venture fund here. Let's say that you raised your fund and you were thinking we're going to do all of our initial investments in a 3-year time period. And we're going to make like 25 investments. But now you're thinking, uh-oh, well, we might not be able to raise money for a while. Let's stretch this initial investment period by 5 years. So now I'm not making like 8 investments a year, I'm making like 5. Well, now the bar just went up, right? You know, for every company pitching you for funding to get one of 5 slots rather than 8. I think it's too early to call. And I thought it was actually a little bit funny. There was somebody who did a post on Twitter a few days ago that was a joke. They were like, oh, why isn't anyone offering advice to early stage founders about how to navigate the downturn? It was a joke because like these memos are coming out everywhere. There were a bunch of VCs who then commented in that thread, actually putting their memos in. It was kind of hilarious. I think that venture investors, you know, who tend to be a fairly egotistical lot, I found in the main, you know, if you look at sort of the herd, tend to say everything is fine until there's a point of crisis. They try to outcompete each other by saying, don't worry. And then after the point of crisis, they can outcompete each other by saying, everybody panic and read my memo or my email that I'm sending you on how to panic and what to do about it. I think we're seeing some of that behavior now. So it's a little bit too early to call, but it does stand to reason that if there's even a blip in capital flowing down from the top, 3, 6, 9 months later, that blip is going to emerge at the portfolio company level. My advice to entrepreneurs would be raise every dollar you can right now. If beforehand you were thinking about, I'm going to right size my round and achieve some milestones, I'll go back and raise again in 12 months. Think, what if I could never raise again? What if I couldn't raise for 5 years? What would I do now differently if I thought the spigot was going to get turned off?
Yeah, I think that's really insightful, really interesting. There are a couple of questions here that are very similar. I think, Matthew, you'd be able to shed some light on this as well, from folks who are mid-career or late career, and they're wondering how they might be able to make a transition at this time into climate-oriented roles. Perhaps they have not had too much relevant experience or domain expertise in the past. Any advice for those folks?
Yeah, it's funny, until recently in our organization, I was the only person whose age started with a 4. Everyone I work with is in their 20s or 30s, so I'm used to this. Yeah, I'm looking at the first one. I think Carrie is the name on the first person who brought this up. Ageism as a bias, even if someone shows up and says, here are the skills that I have, and here are my salary requirements and they fit, just the idea that, well, no, we hire young, smart, fast people, you're not one of them, which is totally unfair. And, a completely rank stereotype is a thing. And, the place where I have seen folks later in their careers be able to get inroads has largely been through spending more time networking and getting closer to early stage startup companies and being helpful for them in small ways that then cause them to be seen through a different light. And to give you an example, one of my extracurricular activities is that I'm a board member at an organization called Greentown Labs, that is the largest, incubator accelerator for climate and energy companies in North America. North of 100 companies in Somerville, Massachusetts, 40 or so in Austin, Texas, and maybe coming to other places near you in the near future. And what I've found is that this has happened several times. There are folks, kind of later career professionals, who have just found ways to kind of come and hang out at the energy bar nights that, Greentown does once a month, present themselves, in the email list or the Slack as, hey, got a lot of experience in accounting and finance. If you've got random questions, none of them too small, would love to be a sounding board for you. And it only takes kind of 1 or 2 of those relationships getting built that tends to cause the lens to change through which people are viewed. This is easier to do if you're in a tech center like Austin or San Francisco or New England. It's harder to do in other places. There's an unfair disadvantage that happens that way. But that's the technique that I've seen play out well.
Great. Just wanted to let the audience know, you can raise your hand if you would like to ask the question yourself, or you can post it into the chat and I'll try to paraphrase it a bit. So there are a few questions around some specific roles, which I'll get to in a second, but I have a more general question that people on these calls often have in their mind. Do you have any advice for folks in general on how to approach structuring their applications for climate roles or applications in general?
A few things. I do think it's a seller's market in some way for labor in these companies, just because of the general market and the fact that so much capital has flowed in to climate investing in the last really 18 months. It means that the number of businesses getting started is really high. The number of positions is really high. And if there's a consistent thread through, every board meeting I have, I'm going to leave this and go into one, it's challenges in getting in talent. With that said, I think there are a few things that I find as early disqualifiers. Like, well, one of the things we'll do in this next board meeting, we're going to look at, a set of technical roles, and we're going to look at what the pipeline is and why we've recently turned people down. I do think that, mission fit, I'm not going to say culture fit. I think from a DEIB perspective, that's actually really coded and unhelpful language. But from a mission fit, that's a really big thing with our portfolio companies. And, they're doing incredibly hard things at an incredibly early stage. The language that I sometimes use with our portfolio CEOs is that if you're trying to be path-breaking, doing something new, it's a roller coaster ride of joy and despair. And you only get joy and despair. Like, it's bimodal. There are no average days. And the only thing that gets you through these down points, whether they're, oh my God, the funding round didn't come through, or oh my God, the catalyst didn't work, or oh my God, we had, this, surprise. Is being able to see the long term and sort of see, that you're going up and down in the sand dunes. How do you have the oasis in your mind that you only see when you're at the top of one? And I think communicating that really explicitly and not in fake ways that people see through, which is like, why am I here? I'm here because I want to make an impact on climate. Well, that's not very helpful to me. I am here because I think that direct air capture is an imperative, for being able to solve climate, even if we decarbonize almost completely. And I want to be able to look up at my children when I'm on my deathbed and tell them I took every skill that I had toward the existential threat of the moment. You can only say that and be credible if it's real. And that's why it's a good test. And I think as an applicant, it's an important thing to think about. If you find yourself saying things that are mission alignment and you can't say them credibly, you are looking at the wrong position. You've learned something about yourself. It's a really good guidance mechanism, I think, to determine fit on both sides. I would say the other thing is being very specific and quantitative about achievements. I think when people show up and what we get is a lot of, I was here and I developed these skills, or I was here and I performed this function. That's kind of helpful. It's good to know. But I engaged a pipeline of 30 prospective customers, narrowed down to a short list of 5, did 3 joint development agreement negotiations and closed, like that's what we're looking for. And there's a technical version of that. There's a biz dev version of that. There's an ops version of that, but they're all quantitative, numerate, and specific.
Yeah, I think there are so many nuggets of wisdom in what you said. I think that was a very unusual and a very insightful answer to that question. We have a specific question here from Edmund. What skill sets and backgrounds do you see as helping lead to chief of staff roles?
Got it. I have seen people be successful in that role from really different ones. I've seen recently minted MBAs. I have seen kind of like people who had focused on art, or on writing, sort of on communications and came into it that way. I've seen people who just happened to be a friend of a friend, with a CEO who sort of ended up there. I think the biggest things are, I'll give you a couple of things. Because the supply demand ratio of those positions is off the charts. I think you first of all just got to stand out in some way. And there's an analogy sometimes used for this. It's this behavior called stotting that herd animals, like if you've ever been fortunate enough to be like in East Africa and you've seen a huge group of gazelles, they tend to go around like this because none of them wants to be on the edge of the pack. They try to get in the middle. Except you'll see a small group of gazelles go off by themselves and they'll jump up and down vertically, which they do more often when a predator is upwind. And the hypothesis is that this is an unfakeable signal. They are saying, I am so fast and so fit. You shouldn't even bother chasing me. And I will prove that to you by jumping up and down in front of you. What is the thing in your life where you've jumped up and down? Is it where you, had the extraordinary support from an advisor who should know better, who you've named and will take a reference call? Is it the extraordinary technical achievement that you had as a bench scientist that's wholly irrelevant to the chief of staff role you want to fill, but shows that you're an outlier, that you're at the outer edge of the distribution of badassery on some dimension? Find something like that sets you apart and lead with it. I think the other is a demonstrated ability, and again, demonstrated is the big thing here, to wear a bunch of different hats at a time. And the third, I think, because a huge part of what the chief of staff role does is save someone's time, is show rather than tell that I can save you time. So, there's one version of that outreach that is, hey, CEO, I'm person XYZ, and I've done these things, and I think I could be a great chief of staff. There is another outreach form that is, hey, CEO, I saw that you last raised capital about 2 years ago, and are probably thinking hard about, how the climate landscape has changed. Please see attached my memo of my rundown on, what the fundraising landscape looks like now and the top 5 funds I would knock on the doors of. You might already know all these, but maybe it's helpful. That person just skipped like 5 steps in the interview process. They stood out in a different way. They showcased their ability to think, write, and speak. They gave someone something useful. So the principle of reciprocity kicks in. I want to give back to you. And they had a clear and concrete next step. You just showed me you can do this job well.
There is a question that I really want to ask you, just because I'm really enjoying this conversation. How do you personally imagine a sustainable planet in the future? What's that vision for you personally?
That implies that I envision a sustainable planet in the future. What if I'm a pessimist? They're actually, why am I getting my phone out here? There's a folder on my phone called Important. And it has things that I think are important and that I want to remind myself of. And there are exactly 13 things in it. And one of them is a passage from one of the C.S. Lewis Narnia books. I think it's The Silver Chair, where like there are two plucky young, hero and heroine, and they've got their comic relief, Swamp Thing sidekick, and the evil witch captures them and takes them underground, and all is lost. And there's this sort of pivotal scene where evil witch brings them in front of her, and she says, "What do you want?" And they say, "I want to see the sky and I want to see the grass." And she tells them, there isn't any sky. It's not any grass. All there is this cave. So you better get happy with it, because all those things you remember, you just kind of imagine them. And right at the point, that hero and heroine are about to kind of lose it, the sidekick character pops up. And I'm going to like abridge this. It says, "One word, ma'am," he said, coming back from the fire, limping because of the pain. "All you've been saying is quite right. I shouldn't wonder. Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things. Trees and grass and sun and moon and stars. Suppose we have. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world. Well, it strikes me as a pretty poor one. And that's a funny thing when you think of it. We're just babies making up a game, but 4 babies playing a game can make a play world that licks your real world hollow. That's why I'm going to stand by the play world. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any Aslan to lead it. I'm going to live like a Narnian, even if there isn't any Narnia. So thanking you kindly for your supper, if these 2 gentlemen and the young lady are ready, we're leaving your court at once and setting out in the dark to spend our lives looking for overland. Not that our lives will be very long, I should think, but that's a small loss if the world's as dull a place as you say. I'm not sure we're going to solve climate. As a father, I'm pessimistic about it. But I think we have to live in a world where we believe we can. And wake up each day with that drive and focus, rather than declaring that woe is us and moving to adaptation.
Wow, that's a great answer. That's very very meaningful. Thank you for sharing that. I just want to say. Let me find a question. Sorry, I got really sucked into your answer, but
Can I jump in with a quick question, Matthew?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So I actually run a small business, and I've been working on this for about 5 years now, but I feel very compelled to work on climate solutions, thinking about my own future children. And so my question to you is, am I better off trying to join a startup and contribute my talents to them, or should I try to pivot my existing business?
What's your existing business?
We do online education for people trying to change careers. So I've been thinking maybe I help other people move into the climate space.
That's interesting. It's a good question. There's always this like fit thing where we're looking for this Venn diagram intersection of what can I do and what's the unmet need. And I think in your case, right, you can think about the what can I do on 2 things. One of them is, it's obvious from this call, right? Like there's going to be this huge, career shift that has to happen. One of the places I'm most concerned about that from a social equity perspective is that we have, I don't even know what the right order of magnitude is. Is it hundreds of thousands? Is it millions? Is it tens of millions? I don't know. Jobs in the US that are dependent on fossil fuel extraction directly or indirectly. We've learned all these wonderful things about the subsurface. And, we can use the subsurface. We can use geology to do different stuff. We can use it to store carbon. We can use it to store electricity. We can use it for all sorts of things, geothermal energy. And there's got to be some transition path. If you had on a 10-gallon hat and spoken a Houston drawl, I would be like, dude, you're in exactly the right place to figure this out. But, maybe you are more generally. The other way you can think about it is, what skills do I have? And if your skills are as a communicator, a facilitator, someone who is able to bridge kind of multiple disciplines, it sounds like, I would guess that has to be a
That's exactly right.
Yeah, there you go. That does have a translation into some of the roles that I mentioned in a couple of the portfolio companies that are about kind of external engagement, or are about hiring, recruiting, training, within these businesses. And that, I don't know, those are the things that first come to mind for me.
Cool. That's helpful. Thank you.
Cheers.
We probably just have time for maybe 2 questions. If we try to squeeze in a couple of quick answers from you, Matthew. So one is, what's the best way for non-tech or people without a tech or with a finance background to break into climate VC? Would you want to break in early or late?
I think you want to make friends. But in terms of, at what stage, I think that's less a question, about what's academically optimal and more about where you most likely be successful. And, you know, I see people more likely to be successful in two things. One of them is where their skills are quite relevant. So, you know, if someone from a finance and accounting perspective, let's just take that one, you know, is really good at audits and compliance. Those are not, you know, top shelf issues, you know, for early stage founders. You know, they're going to waive financial audits, you know, for several years. But are really relevant, you know, at companies that kind of hit the inflection kind of knee in the curve, you know, around growth and scale, where there's now become very, very, very important issues that companies are typically not very well positioned to grapple with. The other, I think, is where people have passion. And, you know, the way I always think about early versus late stage is like, imagine that your workday is, I'm going to wake up and there's going to be a curveball in email before I even open it. And I'm going to work on that curveball. And then like halfway through the day, other curveball is going to come up. And I've now got to choose how I allocate between these two things and prioritize. Does that sound fun to you? And like, that's exciting? Or is it intimidating and I would prefer to like have a more grounded track? That to me is the early versus late stage question. And it's just, you know, you might have the skills that would put you in a position to do something in either, but you're likely to be doing your best work when you're in an environment that thrills you and doesn't terrify you. And for someone who, you know, thrives on controlled chaos, the stable kind of tracked environment is terrifying. You know, and for someone who wants to have a good idea of not only what am I doing today, but next week and this month, the controlled chaos environment is terrifying. Like, flee your terror, you know, and find where you're really comfortable, where you think you can thrive.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. There's a follow-up question to that. Is there room for generalists in climate VC? For example, people skilled in communication?
You know, completely generalists. I think there's room for CEOs and chiefs of staff. I think the chief of staff role is a great one for that. Outside of that, I think in early stage companies, there tends not to be an operations role. It tends to be, you know, if there are 5 people in the business, 3 of them are a lab bench, you know, one of them is figuring out markets, one of them is the CEO. Guess what? The CEO is doing operations. But I find once you get to like the 20, 30 person mark, there now is we've got to organize our stuff internally that is one bit of everything. You know, it's one bit operations and finance. It's one bit, you know, how do we write the employee manual? It's one bit, somebody's going to come up with a copy for the website. It's one bit, you know, we've got to, you know, rationalize our spending on outside services that we've, you know, done on credit cards. We now need enterprise accounts. None of those things are really finance roles. They're not ops roles. Oh, and this person just followed up. And within VC firms or foundations, yeah, totally roles for generalists in the actual venture capital shops. God, you know, I've got 3 colleagues who have PhDs in deep sciences. I got a bachelor's degree in psychology. What do I know? I think, you know, the big thing that is an asset, and Dina, tell me if I'm mispronouncing your name, is the ability to translate. And I find that folks are able to come up to speed quickly on a new category, whether it's a category of sort of climate tech or whether it's a category of finance, that for the most part is about a small amount of vocabulary and a few mechanics. But you sound stupid if you can't use the vocabulary right. That skill that I find to be more of a generalist skill is prized in venture. It's what you have to do all the time when you have a lot of waterfront to cover.
So if I can follow up on that, Matthew, and thank you, like, so how would one, I mean, other than make friends, right, networking in, where would one look or how would one move? Because I'm that late in career, very good at translating, very quick learner, looking for a place where, you know, I've got young adult children, they have this delusion they're going to live in a decent world and that they're going to have kids. I want to put everything I can behind it. And I think these kinds of new technologies are an amazing place to do it.
So a few things, you know, one of them, I hate to just reiterate something beforehand, but sort of networking is the answer, either physically or virtually. But I would say if our experience is like anyone's, find a list of climate VCs, hit their websites and look where they're hiring. We just hired someone into our organization as our first non-investment team member who is director of ops, manager of ops and finance. And, you know, sort of stage of life and background style is very similar to you, you know, joined us from a medical device, you know, sort of large company, grab bag of finance and ops roles, adult children, you know, yada, yada, yada. We found that role impossible to hire for. We had like one false start of someone who didn't make it and, you know, sort of 40 or so inbounds before we found the right mix. you may be in a good seller's market position here.
Fabulous. Thank you. I think there are a few of us like me. That's why I took the minute to.
I hear you.
Great. I really want to be respectful of time. We just have 3 minutes left, but Ion has a question. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, that they would like to ask themselves.
Yes, it's great. Thanks. I have a question. Like you're focused on carbon emissions, and I was wondering, do you know people? What is your opinion on resilience? You know, the third part of the IPCC project,
Sure.
and that deals with how we adapt to the climate crisis we are going to face, like 1+5 degrees at least, because there are many currents. Like in France, there is a low tech current that tries to deal with how to address our needs by using as little resources as possible, or how we make water that's polluted better and stuff like that. So what do you think about that? Do you know people investing in that and stuff?
No, thanks. Yeah, that's helpful. In our shop, this is an active conversation that we're having, and we don't know the answer. You know, our skill set as sort of early stage VC investors, most of the adaptation and resilience approaches, which we think will be sorely needed, are more about infrastructure or real assets. Not all of them, you know, but in the main, more of them. That, you know, is not our skill set. And I think at the level of our sister nonprofit Prime Coalition, there's a lot of thinking going on there about what an appropriate catalytic capital intervention would be. Although I don't think we're quite there yet. I do think there's an element of cognitive dissonance that if our story and our fund is the odds are against us, but we believe that there are breakthroughs and we can make it, it's hard to not only say that, but believe it. And then out of the other side of your mouth say, but it's probably not going to work out, so we got to do other stuff. You can think those things. I think it's hard to operationalize them with the same people and the same funders and the same message. I would tell you that resilience is coming into our mitigation investments in a big way. Like, to give you an example, it's a company I've spent a lot of time with that I think very highly of. We'll see where we go with it. That is focused on optimizing the microbiome of tree roots. Be able to get faster wood growth, which then sequesters carbon both in the wood and underground in the soil carbon. You could look at that as purely a mitigation investment, but the other aspect of it is biodiversity and being able to maintain fungal biodiversity. If we solve climate but end up with monocultures, you know, of trees, like what Borneo looks like today, right? It looks green to us, but it's all palm oil trees. To wildlife, it looks like no food, no water, no shelter. You know, we will just dig the ground out from underneath us. We will solve the problem in the air, and we will now be down a hole, you know, of low biodiversity and widespread monocultures. And we think about that as a dimension of these investments in a way that at least I probably didn't, you know, 3 or 5 years ago. But that's the way I think it touches our thesis.
It's true. Like, I think biodiversity is one of the greatest tools to address climate change. And thanks for your interaction.
Sure.
Well, we're right at the top of the hour, and I know Matthew is really busy, so I want to be respectful of his time. I just want to thank you again, Matthew, for you know, spending this hour with us and sharing all of this wisdom. Just in case you encounter this event somewhere else, we are on workonclimate.org, and we are conducting this event with innovateclimate.substack.com. So go sign up for both of those. And if on the count of 3, everybody that is able to could unmute and say thank you, I think that would be great. So 1, 2, 3. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks. Have a great day, everybody. Cheers.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks, everyone.